Good evening, folks. This is part 2 of my lecture on the origins of modern biology and geology, and specifically on the Darwinian Revolution. If you're coming in late and you have not watched part 1 of this lesson yet, I strongly recommend you go back and watch that first for some vital background information. If you are one of my students for History of Science, then I recommend hop on the Blackboard site, download a copy of the handout that goes with this lesson so that you have all the relevant names and dates and terminology in front of you as you're proceeding with this. All right, though, so picking up where we left off, we have taken a look at some of the reasons why biology and geology are lingering behind other branches of science going into the 17 and 1800s, and we've started taking a look at some of the key developments in that time that are gradually leading us towards this Darwinian revolution, the development of a system of taxonomy that implies the existence of evolutionary forces, the gradual awareness that the world is older than 6,000 years, and tentative explorations of evolutionary forces as a concept and the idea that life may not have been static over time. So let's carry on. I want to begin with talking about a rather eccentric figure in all of this discussion. A fellow from Scotland by the name of James Burnet, B-U-R-N-E-T-T, although he is better known by his title Lord Monboddo, M-O-N-B-O-D-D-O, and a lot of textbooks just call him James Monboddo or Monboddo for shorts. Monboddo was born in 1714. As I write this, we're about a month out from his birthday, April 25th, and died in 1799. He became mostly known as a judge, a linguist, and a philosopher, not as a figure in evolutionary science, although he ends up trending in that direction. Monboddo was mostly noted for being one of the founding fathers of the discipline of historical linguistics, the branch of anthropology that studies the origins of languages and how languages adapt and change over time. Monboddo originated an idea in linguistics called the single origin hypothesis, the idea that all human languages ultimately originated from a single region of the world, spread out as humans spread out throughout the world, and that they began changing as populations diverged from one another. He also originated the idea, considered revolutionary for his time, that so-called primitive languages, like the languages of various tribal peoples that European colonists of the time were encountering in the Americas and Africa, were actually just as complex and sophisticated as European languages, that they simply had different standards of grammar and syntax than were more familiar in Indo-European languages, but nonetheless that they were no less complex or capable as forms of communication, at a time period when most people just assumed that the languages of indigenous populations were effectively grunting and chirping rather than actually meaningful communication. Now, as he is talking about the origin of languages, Monboddo begins speculating on what those earliest people from whom those languages came were like. And this gets him to his conclusion that human language evolved from ape calls, that was the most primitive and basic form of primate communication, and that human language stemmed from that. And therefore, he asserted that, as he put it, apes are, quote, the brothers of man. Monboddo believed that early humans were very much like apes. He proposed that early man was a wild, solitary animal. He proposed that the first humans were herbivorous quadrupeds going around on all fours and primarily eating plant foods. He himself was a vegetarian and was a lifelong advocate of vegetarian diets, which he felt were the more natural state for our kind. He believed that these early humans, in the course of their development, first developed tools and then developed social structures, and only after they had social structures had the need to develop language. Monboddo bought into Buffon's idea of degeneration of humanity and the idea that there were numerous human races that had degenerated from an ancestral stock. He felt that human races could potentially be improved with selective breeding, which is an early idea in the concept of eugenics, although Monboddo does not really propose mechanisms by which that could be done. And he argues that humans and all other animals must adapt and change over time to survive in a hostile world, although he doesn't offer any theory as to how that happens. I think it's also worth noting that Monboddo said that humans had degenerated from our ancestral state, keeping in mind that he believed our ancestral state to be the condition in which we were solitary, herbivorous quadrupeds living by ourselves in the woods. And evidently where we are at now was distinctly not an improvement. Now, Monboddo was pretty eccentric, as you can probably gather, and his ideas got more and more eccentric as he aged. He might have been taken more seriously as a scholar, if not for some of the strange turns that his thinking took. He eventually began arguing that orangutans were actually a form of human, closest to the primal form that early humans had been in, and that we should be treating them as such. He also proposed the idea that some humans, in fact, have tails. And later, he actually elaborated on this idea and said that actually all humans, in fact, have tails, but they are secretly cut off by your midwife when you are born. And therefore, none of us know that we have them. Now, Monboddo got more and more eccentric as he got older, and people didn't take him quite as seriously, so a lot of his rather far-thinking contributions to the connection between apes and humans and ideas of adaptation kind of got lost in the shuffle behind the ideas of mankind's natural state being getting around on all fours by ourselves and the idea of our secret tails. My favorite story about Monboddo involves his legal career. He was a noted jurist and judge, and when he was 71 years old, he was invited to attend the King's Court in London. Quite an honor. And while the court was in session, there ended up being a breakage in a ceiling beam, and the ceiling started to collapse. And nearly everybody in the room realized this was happening, except Monboddo, who at this point in his life had gone nearly deaf and did not hear the creaking and groaning of the beams overhead. So everybody got up and ran out of the room, except Monboddo, who just sat there in his seat looking around, while the ceiling collapsed all around him. Now, he did survive, and they pulled him out of the wreckage, and they asked him, well, why did you not get up and run when everybody else got up and ran? And Monboddo, who was, as I said, eccentric, was Scottish rather than English, and probably didn't want to admit that he was too deaf to have heard the crash, said that when everybody got up and ran out, he thought the mass exodus was, as he put it, an annual ceremony, with which, as an alien, I had nothing to do. All right, now while we're in Scotland, let's talk about somebody a little less eccentric and a little bit more influential, although he doesn't end up getting a lot of credit for his accomplishments. Let's talk about a Scotsman by the name of James Hutton. Hutton is born in 1726, dies in 1797. We're all a few days past the anniversary of his death, March 26th, as I say this. Becomes noted as one of the founding fathers of the science of geology. Hutton, much like Buffon, inherited large amounts of farmland, never needed to work for a living. He spent most of his life as a gentleman farmer, basically meaning a rich dude who really didn't need to work, but decided to keep a farm anyway because he thought it was cool. Now, Hutton was really interested in the new science of chemistry and really wanted to study it. He studied medicine for a time because it was the easiest way to get knowledge about chemistry in the days, back when chemistry was not really a distinct profession in its own rights. Never actually finished a medical degree. But in the course of his time as a gentleman farmer, living on his lands and exploring his estates, he became interested in the landforms, the rocks, and the soil, and began devoting more and more of his time to their study. Hutton spent most of the rest of his life working privately on theoretization in the discipline that today we call geology. He published a 2-volume work called Theory of the Earth, first volume published in 1795. First 2 volumes in 1795. He was working on a third one that was incomplete at the time of his death. In Theory of the Earth, Hutton contested some of the common geological ideas of his time period and offered some new ones on the basis of his observations. Now, 2 important geologic theories that were kicking around in Hutton's time were the ideas of catastrophism and of Neptunism. Catastrophism, 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 was an idea proposed by a German geologist by the name of Abraham Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R. And catastrophism was a geologic theory that posited that changes in the Earth over time were exclusively the result of sudden, sweeping, dramatic events. Big volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, landslides, massive global floods, real wrath of God kind of stuff. And it's not surprising that this is a viewpoint that is figuring in a time when most folks are still taking the literal Bible as truth and are still therefore looking at things like the Great Flood and massive divine wrath earthquake sort of events. And so, yeah, catastrophism is kind of the scientific dress-up of that, where it's assumed that big, sweeping, sudden events are responsible for all geologic remodeling. Another idea that Werner put forward, important idea in geology, was the concept of Neptunism, Neptunism, named after Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. Neptunism was a theory of land formation, and the suggestion there was that land on our planet had formed as a result of the precipitation of minerals from receding floodwater. Once again, fits in very well with a biblical worldview in which people are assuming the literal truth of the book of Genesis and the story of the great flood of Noah. Now, Hutton has a radically different view. His studies of the land have led him to the conclusion that most geological remodeling is not the result of sudden dramatic events. Hutton instead puts forward the very important idea for both geology and biology of uniformitarianism. Bit of a mouthful there. This is uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism. The idea behind uniformitarianism is that the primary forces shaping the land are slow, gradual forces that make tiny incremental changes over long periods of time. Things like erosion, wind, and water, not massive upheavals. Hutton also proposes a new theory of land formation, which he calls volcanism, V-U-L-C-A-N-I-S-M. After Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and the forge, volcanism was the idea that new landforms came about as a result of the cooling of magma from lava coming out of volcanic explosions. And basically volcanic action, hence volcanism, was responsible for the formation of new land. Now, both of these ideas were a radical refiguring of the very biblical kind of worldview, and both of them suggested a much more gradual process of change in the earth. On that basis, Hutton concluded that the world must be far, far older than the 6,000 years commonly touted in his time. Indeed, he suggested the world was very, very ancient, the concept geologists today now call deep time. Hutton actually went so far as to say that he believed the world was of infinite age. He denied the possibility of a moment of creation and suggested that the Earth simply went through continuous cycles of slow, gradual change that it had always been going through and always would be going through. Now, Hutton's ideas are pretty revolutionary, and they're actually a lot closer to our modern understanding than Werner's ideas. Now, we do know today, of course, that some geologic remodeling takes the form of big catastrophes, but most of it, like Hutton thought, is slow, gradual forces that you can see at work in the world around you today. Likewise, we are aware now that volcanism is a pretty good sense of where most landforms come from, that you either get volcanic eruption or you get the upthrust of land where continental plates smash together. So Hutton is a lot closer to an accurate view of the way the world works than Werner and other contemporary geologists. Sadly for Hutton, there was a big problem with theory of the Earth. Namely, the book was absolutely terrible. For all his gifts as a geologist, Hutton was a terrible writer. I've tried to read Theory of the Earth, and I can't get through it. Theory of the Earth is full of run-on sentences that go for pages at a time, commas and punctuation that seem to have been applied with the use of a dartboard thrown at a manuscript, places where he'll start an idea, go off on a tangent that lasts for pages, and then come back to the original idea as if nothing happened. Poor organization, poor sentence structure, basically all the things that you lose points for on your essays. And he did a whole book of this, and it was almost unreadable. As a result, most geologists who otherwise might have benefited from Hutton's ideas really didn't get through the manuscript. And the general public certainly was not reading it. So Hutton's groundbreaking thinking did not become terribly popular. Now, after he died, a friend of his by the name of John Playfair, Playfair, is going to write a condensed version of the text in 1802 called Illustrations of the Huttonian Theory of the Earth. And that condensed version is going to get a little bit more play, and it's going to end up influencing a guy named Charles Lyell that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. All right, so we got some geology rolling. We're starting to think in terms of a much older world. I think it's now time to talk about a guy by the name of Darwin. I, of course, am referring to Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of the famous Charles Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was born in 1731, died in 1802, noted as a physician, poet, and inventor during his lifetime. Darwin had a colorful life. He was the son of a lawyer by the name of Robert Darwin, the youngest of 7 children. He studied medicine at Cambridge University and set up a medical practice in the city of London. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Cambridge has no record of Erasmus Darwin actually having finished his MD. It is altogether possible that in the intervening, 250 odd years, that record got lost somewhere. But the simple fact of the matter is we have no formal documentation that proves that Erasmus Darwin ever legally became Dr. Darwin. Nonetheless, he started calling himself that, set up a very successful medical practice in the city of London. In fact, he was offered the post of royal physician, but he turned it down. Erasmus Darwin had a very busy life. He was married on 2 separate occasions, fathered at least 14 children, 2 of whom were by a mistress, another one possibly by a different mistress. Dude got around. He also moved in some interesting circles. He was a founding member of the Lunar Society. I've mentioned that in a previous lecture. A group of eccentric scientists who met on the night of the full moon every month and were called the lunatics in the popular press. The Lunar Society was founded in 1765 and lasted till 1813. Through his contacts in the Lunar Society, Erasmus Darwin got to be good friends with a number of prominent scientists of the day, including Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Priestley, James Watt, and Joseph Black. All of these were people in whom circles he moved. So, what kind of things is Erasmus doing for the biological sciences? He's a gifted Latin scholar, and he translates the works of Carolus Linnaeus into English. Remember, Linnaeus is one of the last scientists writing in Latin, which is becoming a less and less common practice and extensively a less and less known language. Darwin's translation of Linnaeus into English popularizes Linnaean taxonomy in the English-speaking world. As an inventor, he invents a lot of interesting little gadgets, the most notable being a liquid-fueled rocket, the first liquid-fueled rocket in the year 1779. Little tiny thing by today's standards. He caused a little bit of a stir setting it off in Hyde Park in London. Now, his most notable contribution to our discussion right now is that between 1794 and 1796, he publishes a 2-volume work called Zoonomia, Z-O-O-Nomia, and normally you see 2 little dots over the first O in zoonomia to indicate that you pronounce both O's separately. Please be careful with the spelling of that word. It is zoonomia. Somebody always says zoomania on one of my tests. Now, Zoonomia is a book on biology that anticipates a lot of his grandson's ideas. Erasmus Darwin is one of the first people to talk about what he calls the transmutation of species in the past, the idea that species could gradually change. He notes that humans engage in artificial selection, breeding cattle and plants and other domestic crops and animals for our own purposes, and suggests that a similar thing could happen in nature. He points out that organisms seem to have traits that are adapted to aid them in the particular environments that they come from, and therefore it seems that a sort of adaptation was going on where animals would develop traits that helped them in the world in which they lived. He talks about, for example, the flamingo and suggests that organisms strive for features that they need. And he says that the flamingo grew long legs, for example, to keep its feathers up out of the water. He offers no clear mechanism for this idea of evolutionary change, but he does believe that life has adapted and changed over time to meet the demands of its environments. He is a believer in deism. He says that the first life was created by God, but that God did not intervene thereafter. And he suggests that all living things originated from a common ancestral source. He's coy about the age of the Earth, but he definitely believes in the idea of deep time. And when asked about the age of the Earth, he says that he believes it is, as he puts it, millions of ages old. So doesn't commit himself to a year. He also writes a poem in 1791 in which he talks about the birth of our universe itself. And in this poem, he introduces ideas that, if you compare them to modern physics, sound an awful lot like the Big Bang and the Big Crunch that are proposed by some cosmologists today. So he's interesting in a lot of different fields, and he's introducing some pretty important ideas to our biological discourse, ideas that other scientists, most notably the Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, whom we'll talk about momentarily, and of course his much more famous grandson, are going to pick up on. So back across the pond to France, two French scientists who I want to talk about who are quite important to our evolutionary discussion, whose names will come up in almost any history of evolutionary theory. First off, let us talk about a naturalist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monnet, the Chevalier de Lamarck. Let's just go with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. That was the name that he typically went by, Lamarck. Lamarck is a title of nobility, Chevalier de Lamarck. That's a knighthood. Lamarck was born in 1744, died in 1829, and ends up being a significant figure in the biological sciences for a lot of different reasons. Now, Lamarck is a native of France. He is the 11th son of a poor nobleman. Although he is of noble birth, he's not inheriting a damn thing. So, whenever you're a nobleman's son and you're not first in line and your family doesn't have a lot to pass around, the primary way to make a name for yourself is to get into the military. So Lamarck serves as a soldier. He serves with distinction in the Napoleonic Wars, actually receives a knighthood on the field of battle, retires from military service. Sorry, not Napoleonic Wars. What am I saying Napoleonic? This is well before Napoleon. My bad. Okay. Anyhow, though, but yeah, so he becomes a knight in 1766 and retires from military service because of a severe injury. After that, Lamarck studies medicine. He is patronized by Buffon, who sees a lot of promise in him and funds his studies. And eventually, Lamarck is appointed to a position in the French Academy of Sciences in 1779. And in 1793, he becomes the professor of zoology at the French Museum of Natural History, a position he will hold for the rest of his life. Now, Lamarck makes a wide range of contributions to the biological sciences. He's an important figure in early cell theory, in elaborating on the idea that all living things are built from cells. That idea will be developed into modern cell theory throughout the 19th century by a combination of the work of Lamarck and the Germans Theodor Schwann and Theodor Schleiden. Although Lamarck is kind of the guy who gets the ball rolling with that, with looking at the cell as the fundamental unit of life. Lamarck is also a figure in systematics. He refines some aspects of Linnaean taxonomy, suggesting other ranks and levels of taxonomy, and devising a number of different taxonomic groupings, particularly for fossil animals. Lamarck has an interesting little credit to his name in that he names our field. I say are because I'm one of them, Lamarck is the first person to use the term biology for the science of life in the year 1802. But his biggest interests are in zoology and invertebrate paleontology. Lamarck is one of the first paleontologists. And the field of paleontology, of course, don't confuse it with archaeology. Archaeology is the study of ancient humans. Paleontology is the study of ancient life. Now, Lamarck is a significant figure in paleontology. He is going to be doing a lot of work with invertebrates in particular. He's quite interested in fossil mollusks and fossil shells and fossil fishes, but mostly in the invertebrate, the non-bony forms of life. The fish are a thing he hits kind of incidentally along the way. Now, Lamarck makes some rather detailed studies of these. In 1801, he publishes a book called Système des Animaux sans vertébrés. It's the first in-depth book on the classification of invertebrate life. In this text, he talks a lot about mollusks in particular, and how the study of fossil and living mollusks has convinced him that, as Darwin believed, life was transmuted over time, that life was not static across time. He adopted the Huttonian idea of uniformitarianism, suggesting a slow and gradual cycle of change in the conduct of life. He began arranging living things into a quasi-Aristotelian hierarchy of complexity, kind of comparable to the scala naturae. Lamarck's evolutionary ideas, I should point out, are strictly progressive. This is a big deviation from what Darwin's later going to do, that Lamarck thinks that evolution is always progressive, always a gradual increase in complexity over time, that he doesn't think evolution can be regressive, he doesn't think that you can become simpler over time. A thing that we now know, of course, is absolutely possible. He outlines his evolutionary and hereditary theories, which he kind of works on both together, both evolution and heredity, in several publications throughout the early 19th century. His most important text, published in 1809, is Philosophie zoologique, Z-O-O-L-O-G-I-Q-U-E. That's zoologique, and philosophy spelled with an I-E at the end. So Philosophie zoologique, published in 1809, incidentally the year Charles Darwin was born, Lamarck is publishing the first comprehensive Western evolutionary theory. Now, in Philosophie zoologique, Lamarck lays out a two-part model for both evolution and for genetic inheritance. He does not understand the stuff of heredity. Let's put it out there right now. He's not talking about genes or chromosomes or anything like that. Rather, he has two ways of looking at all this. First off, he says that evolution proceeds through the inheritance of acquired traits, by which he means that he thinks that the things that happen to you during your life, or that happen to an organism during its lifetime, are going to be passed on to its offspring. The forces that influence you will be transmitted to the features of your offspring. So, for example, a guy who works hard out in the fields all the time is going to have kids that are stronger and healthier, whereas a sickly man will have kids of weaker constitution. Lamarck points to his own life from this. Remember, he was injured in his military service. He had a leg injury and later had a son who had a deformity in the same leg. And on that basis, he says, well, clearly my injury got passed on to my son. The other part of Lamarckian evolution and inheritance is the concept of use and disuse. The notion of use and disuse suggests that if an organism makes frequent use of a part of its body, that part will be enhanced in future generations, that it will become larger, more complex, better in some way to meet the obvious need. Furthermore, if a part of the organism's body or behavior is not used, he says it will decline over time. It will become less potent, more stunted, smaller, more vestigial. And this is how he accounts for vestiges like, say, the human tailbone. His classic example of use and disuse is in the giraffe. Lamarck suggests that the ancestor of the giraffe was a much shorter-necked animal, that they stretched their necks trying to get to higher and higher leaves in the trees. And as a result, the offspring were born with longer necks to meet that need. So Lamarck has, in one sweep here, put together a model for accounting for both genetic change, how you pass on traits to your offspring, and evolutionary change, how life might adapt and change over time. Now, Lamarckian evolution, as it comes to be known, is, as I'm sure every biology person listening to this knows, to put not too fine a point on it, wrong. This is not the way things work. For starters, there's nothing about your life events that modifies your DNA in such a way as to meet your needs. There's nothing about me working out in the fields that is going to make my genetics change in some fashion that they are going to have, that my kids are going to be stronger. Likewise, meeting a need is not a thing evolution does. Lamarck makes the common evolutionary fallacy, which a lot of folks who don't know a lot about how evolution works even today still make, namely the idea that new features evolve to meet an environmental need. Lamarck puts the cart before the horse in saying that, okay, the feature shows up to meet the need. Whereas Darwin is later going to realize, no, it's the other way around. Features appear at random, and nature selects which ones are good, which we'll talk about more in a little bit here. So Lamarck's evolution is not correct. It is worth bringing up for a couple reasons, though. One, because it is an idea that's kicked around by a lot of scholars in the time, and although Lamarck ends up having a professional struggle to get his ideas widely accepted, many evolutionary scientists of the day buy into a lot of Lamarck's basic principles, including Darwin initially. Another reason why Lamarck is important is because he is giving us a very important connection, even if he has the order of events wrong, between adaptation and environmental success. The idea that the features that appear in organisms are the ones that will help them to meet their environmental needs. There's a definitive link between how evolution works and the demands of the world that you live in, even if Lamarck makes the mistake of thinking environmental demand comes up first and part arrives to meet the need. And finally, I think it's worth bringing up just because a lot of folks who are not all that well acquainted with evolutionary science kind of in their heads believe something like Lamarckian evolution and think of that in terms of the misconception about how evolution works. So I felt it was important to take a moment to disabuse everybody of that particular notion if you're not already a biology person. Now, Lamarck was very much, I should point out, a materialist. He thought that all of this was driven by natural laws. He had no room for divine intervention in any part of his model. He was also, however, a teleologist. Lamarck thought that life was inherently moving towards perfection, that the goal of evolution was to make a better living thing that was more finely refined over time, and putting humans at the top of a teleological hierarchy. So there's a definite Aristotelian influence in his thinking. Now, Lamarck did get some traction with his ideas. A lot of biologists listen to a lot of what he has to say, but he does end up getting discredited from a couple of different angles. His ideas about inheritance of acquired traits are ultimately going to be disproven in the late 19th century by a German biologist by the name of August Weismann, W-E-I-S-M-A-N-N. And August Weismann does a famous experiment that you might have heard of, in which he cuts the tails off several successive generations of mice in an effort to see if he can in fact breed a mouse with no tail, and he's not able to do that, thus demonstrating that acquired traits cannot be inherited. Lamarck, of course, never knew about Mendelian inheritance. It was going to happen long after his time. Now, unfortunately, he was also savaged from another quarter, but it was a little bit more personal. A lot of Lamarck's ideas were viciously opposed by a colleague of his, another French scholar with whom he had a deep rivalry, and who was the next person on our list. When you're talking natural history in late 18th, early 19th century France, two names always come up: Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Johann Leopold Nicolaus Frédéric Cuvier, or the Baron Georges Leopold Chrétien Frédéric Dagobert Cuvier. Yeah, I know that's one hell of a name. Let's go with the name he tended to use in his professional life, Georges Cuvier. C-U-V-I-E-R. That might be a name some of you know. He's a very important figure in both paleontology and biology. Cuvier was born in 1769, died in 1832. German-born, but French for most of his life, spent most of his life in France. Often called the father of paleontology. which I think several people could legitimately claim that, but he becomes the first really notable and popular paleontologist. Cuvier is interested in the natural world from the time he is a young man. As a boy, he reads the works of both Buffon and, once he learns his schoolboy Latin, Linnaeus. He ends up coming to the French Museum of Natural History, just like Lamarck did. He becomes the professor of comparative anatomy at the French Museum of Natural History in 1795. He and Lamarck butt heads almost immediately, partly personality conflict, partly dispute over ideas, because while Lamarck is a strict materialist, Cuvier is a big believer in the divine intervention lying behind a lot of natural forces. And the two of them do not get along well at all. Cuvier, in particular, leverages his influence in the department. He ends up kind of advancing faster than Lamarck to put Lamarck down and discredit him and limit the spread of his works. Now, Lamarck first makes a name for himself in zoology and paleontology when he is studying the skeletons of African and Indian elephants. And he looks at the two kinds of elephant and notices the differences between them. And then he applies that comparative study to skulls of elephant-like animals that are commonly upturned in caves and in farmers' fields in France. Now, it's not unusual throughout the European continent to find fossil elephant skulls. You, of course, know why this is today. Europeans did not. Most folks, when they found elephant-like remains, assumed that what they were seeing were the remains of Hannibal's elephants. And if you know your ancient history, you might know that a Carthaginian general by the name of Hannibal tried to invade the city of Rome back during the days of the Roman Empire, and famously marched an army of elephants across the Alps in an effort to invade Rome. Hannibal's army was completely defeated. The Romans went on and totally destroyed the city of Carthage, wiped out their civilization, literally salted the earth. But Europeans would find elephant-like fossils from time to time and think, oh, clearly this must be one of Hannibal's dead elephants that didn't make it all the way or whatever. Well, Cuvier took a closer look at these elephant-like skulls and said, something's not right here. These don't look like elephants. Okay, they look like elephants, but they are not African elephants and they are not Indian elephants either. They are not any kind of elephant we have today. They are a kind of elephant that is gone. What he was looking at, of course, as I'm sure you've deduced by now, were the skulls of mammoths and mastodons, the Ice Age relatives, not ancestors, but relatives, cousins more, of modern elephants. And on that basis, Cuvier said clearly, there was at one time another kind of elephant that is completely gone from the earth. Cuvier had discovered the vital phenomenon that you take for granted today of extinction. He was the first biologist to realize that an entire kind of life can go away, that living things are not necessarily static, that they're not going to always be here. It's possible for entire forms of life to die off and for other things to succeed them. Now, this is a crucially important idea for evolutionary science for reasons that should be fairly obvious. The notion of extinction gives us a pathway towards the gradual change of living things over time and the replacement of old species with new species. Furthermore, the phenomenon of extinction ends up inspiring a lot of biologists to think that evolution might be a thing, partly for accounting for why we have all these fossils of organisms that are no longer here, also from a theological perspective, because a number of theologians, ironically enough, are persuaded that evolution must exist on the basis of the phenomenon of extinction. The idea being, and the logic here is, why would a just and loving God create entire species of life only to kill them off? Therefore, the fact that life can go extinct to these folks was evidence that life is not static. And so we have this ironic situation where a certain amount of theological argument in favor of evolution is leveled on the basis of the existence of extinction. Now, Cuvier is going to spend much of the rest of his life studying fossil life, studying paleontology. He is going to focus on vertebrate rather than invertebrate paleontology. He does look at mollusks a bit, largely because he wants to one-up Lamarck. But he spends a lot of his time looking at other fossil animals, most notably fishes and reptiles. He is the first person to propose the idea of an age of reptiles, an ancient time when reptiles rather than mammals were the dominant animals on Earth. And he writes descriptions both of aquatic reptiles, like the ancient mosasaur, and flying reptiles, like the pterosaurs, in addition to things that today we would think of as dinosaurs, although he does not conceive that name. Now, I should point out there's another character in the story who bears a little bit of attention, that Lamarck is benefiting from fossils he has received from other people. He is not a paleontologist going out and digging up his own fossils. I'm saying Lamarck, Cuvier, my bad. Cuvier is mostly getting his fossils from other folks. So one person who I wanted to give special mention to was an amateur paleontologist by the name of Mary Anning, Anning. Now, Anning is a rather remarkable figure in the history of paleontology. She was a poor and relatively uneducated woman from the region of Dorset in England, born in 1799, died in 1847. Mary Anning spent her life as a fossil collector, collecting and selling fossils along the cliffs of Dorset, mostly selling them to tourists, but increasingly over time to scientists. Anning became a noted figure in the geological circles at the time. Nearly all the famous geologists of the early 19th century, including such people as Charles Lyell, Cuvier, and a number of others, bought fossils from her. They noted that she was quite gifted in sketching and illustrating fossils. She discovered numerous fossil organisms, including the first known plesiosaur, the Loch Ness Monster looking kind of thing, the first ichthyosaurs, and the first pterosaurs, or winged reptiles, as well as a lot of other fossil fishes, cephalopods, and the somewhat dubious discovery of the first coprolites, the first fossilized animal dung. Now, Anning sent a lot of her fossils to museums all over the world and became known as a well-reputed fossil hunter and a very gifted anatomist and illustrator. She even did dissections of live fishes and squids, or living, I should say, living varieties, in order to compare them better to the fossil counterparts that she was finding. Sadly for Anning, she was not permitted to participate directly in the scientific community. The Royal Geological Society of London did not admit women, not until 1904, and Anning never saw any of her quite detailed sketches and descriptions of fossils published during her own lifetime. But she is an influential figure in the history of paleontology, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention her. The old tongue twister. She sells seashells by the seashore. The she in that tongue twister is Mary Anning. Now, anyway, though, Cuvier is one of many people who's getting fossils from Mary Anning and from lots of other places as well. He conceives this idea of an age of reptiles that comes from before the modern age of mammals. He notes successive fossil layers with slight differences in species from layer to layer, looking like a progressive series of changes over time. He conceives of the idea of geologic timescales on the basis of dividing the Earth into distinct eras. He introduces the concept of correlation of parts in anatomy. And he is quite interested in trying to figure out how you get new species. But ironically for all of that, Cuvier rejects the concept of evolution. Like I said early on, he's a big believer in divine influence. And Cuvier ultimately concludes that rather than there being some kind of evolutionary change, what you actually have happening is that God creates a bunch of life, just kind of sprinkles life on Earth, what he calls saltationism, A-S-A-L-T, A-T-I-O-N-I-S-M, saltationism. The idea that God basically lays down life exactly as it is, that periodically, Cuvier says, there's a great flood. There's been more than one great flood. And he says, okay, so God makes life, great flood comes in, sweeps away, and then God starts over, makes new life that's a bit better than the life we had before. So basically, when Cuvier sees successive fossil layers, to him, that just means successive great floods with special acts of creation after each one of them. So he rejects the idea of evolutionary change. This is a concept that he argues considerably with Lamarck about, famously saying that Lamarck introduced, as he puts it, hundreds of thousands of years with the stroke of a pen. Cuvier leverages his influence as a well-known paleontologist to discredit Lamarck's ideas of transmutation of species and helps to basically shut down that discussion. So Cuvier ends up being a really big figure in paleontology, but ironically enough, an opponent of evolution, even though a lot of his ideas become quite critical to evolutionary thinking. Now, one of the many geologists that Mary Anning is selling fossils to is the guy who is often regarded as the father of modern geology. I feel like James Hutton really deserves that a bit more, but the guy who is generally looked at as the starting and most central figure in the development of the modern geological sciences is another Scotsman by the name of Sir Charles Lyell. Lyell was born in 1797, dies in 1875. He came from a family of lawyers. His father and grandfather were lawyers. He himself went to Oxford University to study law, but while he was there, he became interested in geology while he was reading Hutton's Theory of the Earth. It's been joked somewhat tongue-in-cheek that maybe the fact that he was trained as a lawyer meant that he was accustomed to reading convoluted, poorly written documents, and therefore he was in a position to understand Hutton. Now, he only practiced law for a short time before deciding that really he was much more interested in the geological sciences, and he strikes out to begin engaging in a lifelong study of the Earth. He travels and writes extensively, accompanied by his wife, Mary. Mary Lyell is herself a fairly gifted geologist, although she has no publications of her own. The two of them travel around the world, studying landforms, rocks, and minerals wherever they go. They travel to Mount Etna, in Sicily, to study the volcanic activity there, presumably, tipping their hat to Empedocles while they're in the area. They travel to the Americas to study Niagara Falls and look at waterfall formation. Ultimately, Lyell makes a living as a popular science writer. He is the first scientist to support himself entirely on his writings. He writes in a very accessible style that ordinary people are able to read. Travel logs, stories of travel and adventures, are quite popular in the 19th century, and Lyell writes a number of travel logs about his geologic explorations and becomes a quite well-known author and scientist. Now, Lyell's landmark work, published in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833, is Principles of Geology. You might have heard of that text. Principles of Geology is a significant text. It is considered the foundational textbook of modern geology, and Lyell will continuously update it with new additions for the rest of his life. Now, it becomes popular among both scientists and laypersons, well illustrated, written in accessible language, and it gets a lot of people familiar with the new science of geology. In geology, Lyell embraces ideas laid down by Hutton and offers much more proof to back them up. He explains Huttonian principles way better than Hutton ever did, summarizes the idea of uniformitarianism with the simple and elegant statements, "The present is the key to the past," which is a pretty good way of saying how all of that works. Now, he offers up proofs from his study of rock layers, of volcanic action, of sedimentation, and so forth, demonstrating that uniformitarianism does work. And Lyell's work is considered some of the definitive early proof that the Earth must be older than 6,000 years. I should point out there's no dating technology available in the time that can really give a precise age. In Principles of Geology, Lyell suggests the Earth is tens of thousands of years old. He privately admits in correspondence to friends that he personally believes the world is millions of years old, but he doesn't dare publish a number that high, let alone the billions that we know about now. He becomes a major advocate of both uniformitarianism and volcanism. which he's able to comment on because of his studies of volcanic activity, becomes a noted authority on both volcanoes and on glacial erosion, and writes quite extensively about fossil life, particularly ancient fossil reptiles and fishes. Now, I should point out another important aspect of Lyell's life has nothing to do with geology, but much more to do with his professional connections. Lyell becomes a very well-known figure, quite popular among both scientists and non-scientists, and one of his great scientific friends is a fellow by the name of Charles Darwin. Lyell is going to be a great inspiration to Darwin in his youth. He is going to encourage Darwin throughout their professional lives. The two men get to be very good friends. Lyell encourages Darwin in the pursuit of his evolutionary theories and comes to believe in them after a while. Initially, Lyell actually didn't believe in evolutionary models. He believed in the saltationism of Cuvier, but after a while, Darwin convinces him. And later, Lyell will become one of Darwin's biggest defenders when Darwin begins facing significant public backlash against his ideas. Lyell gets significant scientific recognition for his work. He eventually receives a title of knighthood, Sir Charles Lyell, 1st Baronet, for his contributions to geology. Now, that seems like a good point to jump to the man of the hour, one of my personal favorite scientists of all time, and one of the single most influential scientific thinkers in human history. I am talking, of course, about Charles Robert Darwin. Darwin was born on February 12th of the year 1809, the exact same day as Abraham Lincoln, died on April 19th of 1882. He's a naturalist and geologist, and of course is most remembered today as the founder of modern evolutionary theory. His model of natural selection is arguably one of the single most important scientific ideas of all time, an idea whose importance goes far beyond the field of biology itself, and indeed forces us, like all the great scientific revolutions have, to question who and what we are. Only this way, it's in a very literal, very visceral way of questioning what we are as living things and how we got to be this way. Now, Darwin is providing here a unifying principle for the entirety of the biological sciences. You can already see he's building on other people's work, and I will give Darwin some props here. Unlike Isaac Newton, responsible for the last great scientific revolution, Darwin is more than happy to admit the contributions of his colleagues and praises other scholars for their work and acknowledges the people who inspired his own. So he is rising to the top here. He's the culmination of centuries of research, but he pays his intellectual dues. Now, Darwin is born in the small village of Shrewsbury in England. He is the 5th of 6 children. You, of course, already know that his grandfather Erasmus had already made strides as a natural historian, although Erasmus Darwin has been dead for several years when Darwin was born. His father, Robert Darwin, is going to be a very noted physician and a member of the Royal Society of London. As a boy, Charles grows up in a very privileged household, a family of prominent doctors and landowners, and from the time he is a young man, he is enraptured with the natural world. The young Darwin, who is largely raised by his sister after his mother dies when he's at a very early age, gets a reputation as being kind of a troublemaker as a schoolboy, because he is not interested in the classical curriculum of a well-off British schoolboy. He doesn't care about learning Greek and Latin and stuff like that. He cares about prowling around the countryside, collecting bugs and rocks and fossils, and poking his nose into burrows and trying to learn as much as he can about the natural world. His father despairs of him doing anything good with his life, and he's upbraided on more than one occasion for focusing so much on his personal hobby of studying nature as opposed to the more formal demands of his education. Now, when Darwin comes of age, he wants to be a natural historian more than anything else. But his father says to him, "Son, you're a Darwin. Your grandfather was a physician. I am a physician. You're going to be a physician." And so Charles is packed off to Edinburgh, Scotland, where he enrolls in Edinburgh University, lives with his older brother, also named Erasmus, who is already a physician, to study medicine. Darwin does not do well in the study of medicine. Doesn't like it one bit. He's not enjoying what's going on. He finds it does not suit him well. He is horrified by some of the brutal medical treatments of the time. He writes in his journals about witnessing an operation on a small child performed without anesthesia, because there really wasn't any anesthesia to speak of. And he finds that what simple anesthetics are available give him stomach sickness. Darwin just finds medicine is not his thing. So after a year of medical study, he comes home and says, I can't do this. I'm sorry. I can't be a doctor. I am not fit for this work. But while he was in Scotland, he did have the opportunity to take his first ever classes on natural history. There, he fell under the influence of a professor named Robert Grants, who was a big advocate of Lamarckian evolution and introduced Darwin not only to that, but also to the fundamentals of the geological sciences, particularly an interest in marine animals that would last Darwin for the rest of his life. So he comes home after a year of medical school, finds that he just can't do this, and says, sorry, can't do it. I'm going to have to find a different career. I want to be a natural historian. His father throws up his hands and says, boy, if I can find no useful occupation for you, then I shall make a priest out of you. And he pecks him off to Cambridge University, enrolls him in Jesus College in Cambridge to become an Anglican priest. Now, not Jesus College, Christ College, my apologies. But you might find a certain irony in this, that Darwin, the evolution guy, is going to college to be a priest. You might be very surprised to learn that he was completely okay with this. Darwin was a religious man. It is often reported in biographies of him that he was an atheist or deeply agnostic. In truth, Darwin was quite spiritual. Admittedly, his spirituality had much more in common with Unitarianism than it did with his Anglican faith. He was a big believer in reason and was troubled for much of his life by the inherent conflicts that he was seeing between a lot of his own religious ideas and the scientific discoveries he was making. He never really figured out how to reconcile that completely, but he knew that the science was not lying to him. So Darwin was actually completely down with the idea of becoming an Anglican priest. To his thinking, all right, a priest is a good living. It's indoor work with no heavy lifting. You only really need to do stuff a couple days out of the week. You're a pillar of your community. Everybody loves and respects you. Being a priest is a respectable occupation. You can move in the circles of polite society. And most importantly, from his standpoint, being a priest was considered an intellectual profession, which meant that in the standards of the 19th century, when all that was required for you to do science was to have an education, not necessarily to be have a degree in science, Darwin can say, all right, I'm an educated man. I am fit to do scholarly work as an independent gentleman scholar. So I can become a priest. And it's totally acceptable for priests to have academic hobbies. And his, he figured, would be natural history. So Darwin figures it'll be great. I'll become a priest. I'll settle down in some nice little country parish where I have easy access to the natural world. I'll do my priesting, but I'll spend most of my time doing what I really want to do and studying nature. It sounded to him like a pretty good deal. Now, in Darwin's 4 years at Cambridge, he ignores a lot of the studies he is supposed to be engaging in, just like he did as a schoolboy, and spends a significant amount of his time riding, shooting, carousing, and, of course, studying nature. He's obsessively collecting specimens. He becomes quite interested in beetles. There's a little bit of a craze among English gentlemen for beetle collecting in those days, and Darwin becomes an avid beetle collector. The variation he notes in beetles becomes a significant part of his writings about evolution later. And if you go to Darwin's house, Down House in England to this day, you can see his beetle collection on display. Now, at Cambridge, Darwin takes as many natural history classes as he can get away with cramming into his curriculum. He is aided and abetted in his studies by two of his professors, the Reverend Adam Sedgwick, Sedgwick, who, among other things, was a fossil collector himself, bought fossils from Mary Anning. Adam Sedgwick introduces Darwin to geological study in more detail. His other professor who helped him out was the Reverend John Stevens Henslow. John Henslow was a botanist And he frequently helped Darwin to get out of classes he didn't want to be in by saying, oh, I need Mr. Darwin's help in my labs. He needs to come and help me out here. And so Darwin spent a lot of his time in Cambridge studying with those two men, as opposed to paying attention to the theology he was supposed to be studying. Now, like so many of us do in our senior year, he got his shit together at the last minute, and Darwin did well in his comprehensives. He finished his BA, came in 10th in his graduating class. And things are going pretty well, right? Year after he graduates in 1831, the summer after, he travels to Wales with Adam Sedgwick. The two men spend the summer in Wales together, mapping out the landforms, making a geological map of Wales. Darwin comes home after that, and he is all prepared to take holy orders, get ordained an Anglican priest, and settle down for that nice little country life. But it doesn't happen quite like that. When Darwin returns home from his trip to Wales, he gets a letter that October of 1831 from his old professor, Reverend Henslow. And Henslow says to him, hey, before you get all comfortable and settle into your ecclesiastical life, I got an opportunity for you. I have gotten word that there is a sailing ship leaving England later this year, the HMS Beagle, His Majesty's ship, the Beagle. The Beagle is going on a round-the-world expedition. It is setting forth to map the coastlines of South America. It's going to sail down one coast and up the other coast, come home by way of the Pacific Ocean. The voyage is slated to take 2 to 3 years. There's a position available on the ship. It would be a really good opportunity for a young man who's interested in the natural world to see things no scientist has ever documented before. You might want to think about it. Darwin loved this idea, and he jumped at the opportunity. Now, his father thought this was a bunch of ridiculous nonsense. He's like, well, enough with the natural history crap, boy. Settle down already. But fortunately for Charles, a family friend by the name of Josiah Wedgwood, if any of you know Wedgwood pottery, he's the patriarch of the Wedgwood pottery family. But Josiah Wedgwood is a family friend of the Darwins, and he intervenes on Charles's behalf and says to Robert Darwin, let the boy have his fun for a couple years. There used to be the tradition of young men making a grand tour before they settled down. Let him do this thing. And so Darwin's father relents and agrees to allow his son to go on the voyage. So Darwin travels to London and meets up with the captain of the Beagle, a fellow by the name of Robert Fitzroy. That's F-I-T-Z, capital R-O-Y. You capitalize the R in the middle of the name Fitzroy. The reason for that, because if you don't know this, whenever you see a last name that begins Fitz, that was a prefix you had to stick on your last name under English law for a long time if you were born illegitimate. That basically you weren't allowed to take your father's last name in unmodified form if you were born out of wedlock. So Robert Fitzroy was the son of somebody with the surname Roy. So Darwin goes and meets up with Robert Fitzroy to interview for the position on board the Beagle. Now, a lot of textbooks are going to tell you that Darwin was the naturalist on board the Beagle, that was his job. It ends up being his job. It was not what he was hired to do. In fact, there was another naturalist hired for the Beagle early on that eventually Darwin ends up sort of co-opting his work, and the other naturalist quits and goes home. But Darwin was hired to a very different position on the Beagle, and the position he was hired to takes a little bit of explanation because it has no analog in the modern world. His position was called Captain's Companion. Now, understand this about the class structure of England in this time period, that when you're looking at 1830s England, there's a very rigid class structure. And if you are a ship captain of one of Her Majesty's ships, you are a gentleman. You're an upright member of society. You're an aristocrat. You're upper crust. Whereas if you are a sailor, you are the lowest life, scumbag, filthy villain that anybody can imagine. Therefore, it is considered completely inappropriate for the ship captain to be buddies with his crew. They are seen as low-class lowlives, whereas he is a fine, upstanding gentleman. It's not appropriate for them to be socializing. For that reason, long ship voyages, especially ones lasting a couple years like the Beagle's is slated to last, end up being kind of lonely for the captain, because he can't really get to be friends with the other people on the ship. So, it becomes common practice in the day to hire a captain's companion, basically a paid buddy for the captain, somebody who is considered to be of his social standing, usually a son of an upper-class family, somebody with good education and good breeding by the standards of the day, somebody who is of appropriate station for the captain to hang out with, who then can take meals with him and talk with him and basically keep the captain company for the duration of a long voyage. Standard practice was to hire a companion who was interested in the same stuff you were interested in. And Fitzroy was really into natural history. So Darwin applies for the position. He goes to London, meets up with Robert Fitzroy. The two of them spend a week together hanging out to see how they get along. Now, initially, Fitzroy almost dismissed Darwin out of hand. Like the moment he saw him, he considered saying, sorry, can't do it. The reason being, Fitzroy was a big believer in a thing called physiognomy. 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 Physiognomy was the old belief that you could learn things about someone's personality from their facial features. It was believed that certain facial features telegraphed certain personality traits. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle. It was quite popular in medieval England. If you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in one of your literature classes at some point, you know how when Chaucer describes the pilgrims, that he pays great detail to their facial features and so forth. That's because Chaucer's audience, a well-educated audience in the Middle Ages, would have known physiognomy, and therefore they knew the personalities of the pilgrims from the moment Chaucer wrote them, because he wrote them in accordance with physiognomic principles. Now, physiognomy was taken seriously enough in 1700s England that physiognomists were called as expert witnesses in court. You could have a physiognomist come in and testify and say, well, that man could not have committed that crime. Look at his honest forehead, you know, or clearly this guy is a thief. Look how close his eyes are together. Stuff like that. By the time the 1830s roll around, physiognomy is kind of on its way out, but there are still people who believe in it. Robert Fitzroy believes in physiognomy, and the moment he sees Darwin, he says the shape of his chin reveals that he is a man of little ambition who will not amount to anything. But Fitzroy decides to give him a chance, and they chat for a week, and they really hit it off. They find they get along famously, and so Fitzroy reluctantly agrees to overlook Darwin's chin and accept him as companion for the voyage. Now, the voyage of the Beagle is a landmark event in the history of science. Probably one of the single most important scientific expeditions to ever take place, even though it was in point of fact not actually a scientific expedition. The purpose of the Beagle was not to do science. The goal of the Beagle was to map the coastlines of South America, to make a detailed map of the coastlines of South America. The idea was the Beagle would set sail from London. It would sail down the eastern coast of South America, around the tip at Tierra del Fuego, come up the western coast of South America, and then head home by way of the Pacific Ocean, because although it's hard to visualize this, it is actually faster to get back to England by crossing the Pacific, going around Africa and back up, than it is to go back down, back up South America and across the Atlantic. This is why the Panama Canal was a really important development in global trade, because it made the passage across the Americas way faster. Now, the Beagle sets sail. The voyage of the Beagle is going to depart on December 27th of the year 1831. It was supposed to leave actually on December 26th. However, on the morning of December the 26th, the entire crew of the Beagle was so hung over from a Christmas party the previous night that they were completely unable to sail. So the ship delayed its departure for a day, set out on December 27th of 1831. The voyage of the Beagle was slated to last for 2 years. It lasted for 5. The Beagle went across the Atlantic, up and down the coastlines of South America, made its way across the Pacific, island by island, making stops at a number of British possessions along the way, dipped down to see Australia and New Zealand and Tasmania, skipped around to the Indian Ocean, put in at ports of call in British colonies in India and Mauritius, bopped into the British colonies in the southern part of Africa, in South Africa, made a couple of other stops along the African coast, made one last stop back across the Atlantic to hit point in Brazil to correct a map number on the way back, and then zipped up back to England. The reason it ended up taking 5 years rather than 2, a couple of reasons. One of them was because the Beagle ran into some unexpected complications with the mapping. They had to go back a few times and recheck a couple of measurements. One of them was because they had the misfortune to be mapping South America right at the time when virtually every Spanish colony in South America was rebelling against Spanish rule. If you know your South American history, you know that the early 1830s is when Simón Bolívar and other revolutionaries in the Americas were fighting for South American independence. And so the Beagle got caught up inadvertently in a number of rebellions in South America, which, needless to say, slows things down a bit. And finally, the third reason why the Beagle took so damn long was Darwin. Because every time the Beagle got put into port anywhere, Darwin would scurry off the ship as fast as he could, partly because he got super seasick on the way and he did not like being on a ship, and then he would spend sometimes weeks at a time on shore, exploring the natural terrain, eagerly documenting the landforms, studying the geology, and collecting thousands upon thousands of specimens of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils. Throughout the voyage, Darwin kept copious notebooks, journals of his findings, and he kept crate after crate of specimens, which anytime they would put into port, he would pack them up, he would put them on another ship making its way back to England, care of John Henslow. So he was continuously shipping his journals and his specimens back home to England throughout the voyage. Now, the voyage of the Beagle ends up being a pretty cool time for Darwin, and I strongly recommend all of you, if you're looking for some interesting reading that's in the public domain, for a while we are a little bit isolated right now, I strongly recommend you check out Charles Darwin's book, his account of his own voyage, called The Voyage of the Beagle. It's still in print. It ends up being a really good travelogue. You know, it's a story of the adventures of a young scientist who gets to basically explore the entire world, visits almost every continent, and sees things that no scientist has ever documented before. Darwin writes in a very kind of dry sense of humor style. You know, he's not as, hard to read as a lot of contemporary authors. A little bit self-effacing, tells some humorous stories, and very accessible language. And he has a lot of really interesting adventures while he's on this 5-year voyage. He rides with gaucho cowboys in Argentina. He witnesses some of the great rebellions of the 19th century. He gets caught up, actually, with a group of refugees at one point, and he has to disguise himself as a refugee in order to get away from Spanish soldiers. He climbs mountains, he explores jungles, he goes out into deserts. He tries to collect as much natural history as he possibly can. And he's observing amazing things. Now, throughout the voyage of the Beagle, a couple of trends dominate Darwin's life. One, he's trying to get as many specimens as he can possibly get. Rocks, plants, animals, you name it, he's getting as much of the natural world as he can possibly study, sketching it, describing it. He was quite a good sketch artist, incidentally. His journals have quite lovely sketches in them. But takes copious notes, and then, of course, ships the specimens home. Now, when Darwin encountered a new animal, he would try to get 2 specimens of it. One of them would be a specimen for study and to send home. The other one would be a specimen to eat. Because when Darwin was up at Edinburgh, he joined a gentleman's club dedicated to eating exotic meats. And therefore, he was trying to eat a sample of just about every animal that he collected. He claimed the finest meat he ever ate in his life was the agouti, which was a South American rodent about yay big. His notebooks, if you read Darwin's journals from his voyage, you'll find wonderful things written in his journals. I got the opportunity to peruse some Darwinian journals a few years back. And he had a note that I loved that said, "Encountered a peculiar lizard today, approximately the length of my forearm, pink scales around its throat, tasted a bit like pork." So this is the kind of thing you see happening here. The other thing that Darwin would do with his animals is that when Darwin encountered an animal that was not afraid of him, he would try to pick it up. Darwin had a very hands-on approach to the study of nature. He was kind of, if you remember Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, Darwin and Steve Irwin would have gotten along famously because Darwin was delighted with every animal he encountered. He'd go over to them, he'd pick them up, try to hold them and look at them, and see what they would do. Sometimes that meant biting him. And if the animal was big enough, Darwin would try to ride it. This worked out okay when he was trying to ride the giant Galapagos tortoises off the coast of South America, and he'd climb on the back of their shells and tap them with his cane to giddy-up them along, although he said he had rather a hard time keeping his balance. It didn't work out okay when he tried to ride a rhea, a giant South American bird, flightless bird. The rhea threw him off, he bashed his head against a tree and was unconscious for more than a day. But he had this very zestful, fun-loving approach to life, very hands-on approach to everything. He was clearly utterly enraptured by all the adventures he was getting to engage in. So, Darwin sets out on his voyage, and not long after leaving, he starts getting excited, because on his way out the door, Henslow gave him a parting gift, the first 2 volumes of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Darwin devoured them on the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. By the time he got to South America, he was eager to test out Lyell's ideas for himself, and the first thing he did when he got into a South American port was put in an order for the 3rd volume of Principles of Geology to be sent for him to pick up at the next port that they were checking in at. Now, Darwin runs out into nature, begins looking at rock forms and land forms, studying the things that Lyell was talking about to see what he could see for himself about. The big moment came when he was in Chile, and Darwin witnessed an earthquake that almost leveled the city of Asuncion in Chile. He wrote an excited letter home to Charles Lyell, saying, "Mr. Lyell, I have witnessed this massive earthquake and seen how little it changed the nearby landforms. Your ideas of uniformitarianism are true, and I have seen them with my own eyes." That letter was the beginning of a lively friendship between the 2 men that would last the rest of their lives. Now, as Darwin is on this voyage, and as he is engaging in all these adventures, he is noting some fascinating things. Darwin notes that in mainland South America, he finds fossils of giant sloths and giant armadillos from the Ice Age, living in the same lands where their much smaller living counterparts are today, and he wonders why. He travels to Tierra del Fuego, in which he encounters indigenous peoples living in a much simpler state of life, and he wonders if perhaps humans, therefore, must have originated from a much simpler state of being. I should point out Darwin was a violent opponent of slavery. He hated it. It was something he and Captain Fitzroy disagreed about very strongly. They had a big fight about it on the voyage. Darwin witnesses egg-laying mammals in South America. One of his claims to fame is he brings a live platypus back to England at a time when a lot of Englishmen thought the platypus was a fake animal that somebody had made by stitching parts of a duck and a beaver together. And he wonders, how do you end up with an egg-laying mammal? Now, of course, the seminal event of Darwin's voyage, and the most famous part of his voyage, is the month in 1833 that the Beagle spends in the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a small island chain off the western coast of South America, about 600 miles west of the Republic of Ecuador, which they belong to today. The Galapagos Islands, then as now, are almost uninhabited, and they're home to extraordinary wildlife. Giant tortoises, the largest turtles in the world, the largest land reptiles in the world, actually, live in the Galapagos. You're going to find sea lions. You're going to find marine iguanas, the world's only swimming lizards. You're going to find blue-footed boobies. You're going to find the northernmost penguins in the world. The Galapagos is a paradise of nature. And as they travel from one island to another, mapping, Darwin gets ashore on these islands, and he notices patterns. He notices that every island seems to have its own indigenous subspecies of the giant tortoise, with small variations that make them well suited to the terrain of the islands. For example, in islands where the primary food supply is low-lying grasses and shrubs, the tortoises have low domed shells for creeping underneath branches. Whereas on hillier and more mountainous islands, the turtles have a saddle-shaped shell that allows them to stretch their necks higher up the slopes to reach plants that would otherwise be hard to climb to. He notes similar patterns with the iguanas, finding that there are several different varieties of marine iguana on different islands. And in particular, he notes the finches. And if you know anything about Darwin and his animal studies, you probably know about Darwin's finches. There are 15 indigenous species of finch in the Galapagos Islands. Darwin studied 14 of them. One of them has been discovered since his time. And he noted that all these different finches had different kinds of beaks, well suited to the particular food supply on the islands they lived on islands where there were hard-shelled nuts available. The finches had thick, heavy beaks for cracking them open. On islands where insects were the best food supply, they had long, narrow beaks for pulling them out of burrows. And all of them kind of resembled each other, and all of them kind of resembled the mainland finch that Darwin had seen on the coasts of South America. So he's only in the Galapagos for about a month, but in that time, he makes extraordinary discoveries that inspire him very, very much and become seminal to his later thinking. And by the way, if you ever get the opportunity to visit the Galapagos Islands, I highly recommend it. I've been twice now. It is an extraordinary paradise. The entire population of the Galapagos Islands is maybe about 30,000 people scattered among every island. Most of them are uninhabited, and a lot of the same animals that Darwin studied can still be seen there today in their natural habitats, completely unafraid of humans because they've never needed to worry. My favorite story about Darwin's entire voyage is that when he was in the Galapagos, he sees a marine iguana sunning itself on a rock near the ocean. And he's like, I wonder if they can swim. So he tromps up to it. The iguana doesn't try to move. It's never had to deal with a human before. It's not afraid. Honestly, when I was in the Galapagos Islands, I tromped right up to marine iguanas and got in their faces, and they didn't care. And Darwin picks up the unresisting iguana, which doesn't know what to expect here, and throws it into the ocean to see if it can swim. The poor lizard, not really knowing what he's getting himself into, climbs back up on the rock. Darwin is delighted by this, grabs the iguana, hurls it into the ocean again, and apparently did this 7 times in a row before the iguana finally decided it would be a good idea to move on to someplace else. Which kind of illustrates the sort of fun-loving approach to life that Darwin took. So, all these things are happening. One last thing that's worth pointing out about his time on the Beagle is that Darwin gets sick while he's there. He becomes very ill on the western coast of South America, contracts a disease that leaves him bedridden for an entire month. We still to this day do not know what Darwin got sick with, but for the rest of his life, he experienced periodic bouts of the recurring illness, in which he would suffer from serious anxiety, deep depression, headaches, dizziness, digestive troubles, nausea, and great fatigue. And these bouts would go on for anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks. As Darwin got older and older, his episodes of pain and anxiety and discomfort got more frequent and longer, till by the end of his life he was barely leaving his home. To this day, we do not know what disease Darwin was afflicted with. It's a favorite game of medical historians to say, what was Darwin's mystery illness? Because it doesn't really match anything we know now. It's been suggested it might have been a condition called Chagas disease, but even then it doesn't quite match. So we're not 100% sure what it was that he got sick with there. Now, after a long voyage, Darwin finally arrives back home in England almost 5 years to the day after he departed in 1836. And he comes home to a great surprise. Namely, he's famous. Because it seems the entire time Darwin has been on his voyage, his buddy Henslow has been publishing extracts from his journals in the London Times and exhibiting some of his specimens in museums. Darwin's adventures have been followed by the English people for almost his entire voyage. And he comes home and finds he is the most famous naturalist in his country. At this point, his father rolls his eyes and says, okay, fine, boy, I guess you can be a natural historian if you want to, and gives Darwin a large enough allowance out of the family fortune that he can do any damn thing he wants for the rest of his life. So, Darwin never becomes a priest, never gets ordained. He does settle down to a nice little quiet house in the country where he can be close to nature. Down House, it's called. You can still go visit Darwin's house today. He does get married. He marries his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, of the Wedgwood family, and has 7 children with her. They are very happy together by all accounts. One of my other favorite Darwin stories is that there's a page in one of his journals in which he made pro and con lists about whether or not he should marry Emma. In the pros list, one of the things he says is constant companion and a friend in old age. Better than a dog anyhow. And in the cons column, he writes less money for books and terrible loss of time. Obviously, he decided in favor of the Union, and by all accounts, he and Emma were very, very happy with each other. So he settles down. He begins publishing almost right away. In the years following the return from his voyage, Darwin writes a number of academic papers to establish his reputation as a real rigorous scientist. He doesn't want to be thought of as a rich boy who got to go on an adventure. He wants to prove that he has the chops to be a real natural historian. So he writes a number of papers and texts about his findings. He becomes, among other things, a noted expert on fossil mollusks and on orchids. In 1839, he also publishes The Voyage of the Beagle, his first-hand account of his trip, which becomes an immediate bestseller. Darwin's writings about his various observations establish his reputation as a rigorous scientist. He becomes a Fellow of the Royal Society of London and of the Royal Geologic Society, and he never holds any formal academic posting. But he is a well-respected figure in the circles that scientists move in. He has many publications, and he is often called upon as a speaker about science, although he does less and less of that as he gets older and sicker. So he's doing all of this, but he also has begun a secret notebook. And in Darwin's secret notebook, he begins sketching out the ideas first forming in his head during his time in the Galapagos, which were eventually going to make him famous. In 1837, Darwin begins his evolution notebook, and he works on it patiently for years. He collects the observations of other scientists to learn what they can teach him about biogeography and the fossil record. He studies fossil collections, both his own and those of other scientists from the Royal Geologic Society. He does breeding experiments with pigeons to try out his own hereditary ideas. He becomes a frequent visitor of the London Zoo to study the behavior of the monkeys and apes there. And he interviews farmers and ranchers and other people who can teach him things about artificial selection. Also, of course, continues his own studies of bugs and rocks and specimens in the wilderness around himself, as much as he's able. Now, Darwin makes a key breakthrough in the year 1838. And if you want any better evidence that it's a good idea for a scientist to also be educated in the humanities, which I guess if you're listening to a history of science lecture, you presumably already believe that at least a little bit. But Darwin was a big advocate of you needed to be a well-rounded scholar. It was not good enough to be good at just one thing, that as a scientist you needed to read about other disciplines as well, social sciences and humanities and so forth. So one day in 1838, Darwin is reading an essay by an English economist by the name of Thomas Malthus, Malthus. If you've had a macroeconomics class, you might already know that name. Malthus is considered one of the founding figures in the science of economics. And he writes an essay called Essay on the Principle of Population, the foundation of so-called Malthusian economics. In the essay on the principle of population, Malthus describes society as a struggle for existence, and he says that there are insufficient resources for everybody to get fed. Malthus says that the population will always outstrip the food supply. Therefore, he says, some people aren't going to make it. Some people are not going to get what they need. Malthus makes the arguments that those who will succeed in society are the ones who have the greatest advantages of birth, the ones with good educations, the ones born into good families, that sort of thing. Now, a lot of Malthusian ideas, I should point out, have been co-opted for some rather brutal economic ideas about basically letting people die because they clearly couldn't cut it, although some modern economists are looking at it from the perspective of Malthus was the first to realize that some people have an inherent head start in life, which is often not recognized by those who think that, they got where they got strictly on the merits of their own talents when they started off from a better place than other people. But that's a story for economics, not for here. Now, Darwin looks at this idea, this economic theory, and he says, I can see where this fits in with my observations of the natural world. And he folds Malthus's ideas into his developing theory. Now, by the year 1844, Darwin effectively has a full manuscript, but he refrains from publishing it. He's afraid of the reactions. He's afraid of the reactions from his wife's very conservative family, because he knows this is going to fly in the face of their religious beliefs. He's afraid society is going to denounce him. He is bothered by the fact that there is a significant hole in his own ideas, namely that he does not have a solid hereditary theory. Darwin tries to develop his own theory of heredity. He develops an idea called pangenesis, in which he suggests that every part of the body produces little particles that he calls gemmules, Gemmules, which collect in the gonads and are transmitted to the offspring during sex, and that each part of the body basically makes these little particles that teach the growing organism how to grow that part. Darwin's ideas are actually overturned by his own cousin, Francis Galton, who's going to do experiments in which he injects white rabbits with blood from black rabbits to put the gemmules into the white rabbit and see if he can make the white rabbits produce black offspring, which they do not do. Galton, incidentally, is another guy who's going to run off with Darwin's ideas and use them in ways that he himself does not approve of. Francis Galton is considered one of the fathers of eugenics, the idea of selective breeding of humans to make a better human, which inherently always ends up involving choosing who gets to breed and who does not. And Galton ends up being the first serious scientific advocate of a very ugly theory that is going to ultimately form the basis of such things as the Holocaust. And Darwin is horrified by this. Darwin does not like the misapplication of his ideas for social Darwinism or eugenics. He says that it's a betrayal of everything he's working on. But I digress. So Darwin doesn't have a hereditary theory. His own pangenesis model doesn't work, and he sees that as a significant weakness in his own theories. Ironically enough for Darwin, Gregor Mendel, the genetics guy, ends up doing his research during Darwin's lifetime. And Darwin is sent a copy of Gregor Mendel's Experiments in Plant Hybridization by a German colleague. Darwin's a popular guy. He gets a lot of books sent to him by a lot of people. He gets this book, says, oh, that looks nifty, shoves it onto his bookshelf, and never gets around to reading it. Mendelian genetics was literally within arm's reach of Darwin at the desk he worked at for the rest of his life, the book that would have solved the single biggest hole in his own theories. He never got around to reading it. We know this because in those days, whenever you were publishing a book, the pages would be sealed across the front of the book during shipping, and you get a paper knife and cut the book open. The book was found still sealed shut on Darwin's shelf about 20 years ago. The moral of the story, my friends, is read your textbooks. There is important stuff in there. Anyhow, Darwin has all these misgivings. Now, his friends, people like the English scientist Joseph Hooker and Thomas Henry Huxley, and of course Charles Lyell, are all urging him to bring his ideas forward. But Darwin is hesitating. He mentions his ideas in passing in other papers that he's writing to sort of establish his priority. But he doesn't want to bring them to the fore. And in fact, he is making arrangements to have his book posthumously published, so he doesn't have to deal with the fallout. That all changes in 1858, when Darwin gets a letter from a young naturalist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace, who was born in 1823, dies in 1913, is a naturalist who read about Darwin's adventures as a young man, was inspired to go on his own voyage of discovery. Wallace is going to travel to South America like Darwin did. He's going to travel up and down the length of the Amazon River. He's later going to go to Sumatra, in what is today Indonesia, to explore there. Now, while Wallace is in Indonesia, he develops a brain fever, and he's confined to his tent for several weeks recovering. Now, he writes a letter to Darwin, and he says, Mr. Darwin, while I have been in my fever dreams, I have had this wondrous inspiration about a way that life might have adapted and changed over time, and I wonder if you could tell me what you think of it. And Darwin continues reading and finds that Wallace has independently arrived at the exact same ideas that he did. It is completely unsurprising that this happened. After all, the two men were looking at the same world and coming to accurate conclusions about how that world worked. So if anything, this was a pretty good affirmation that Darwin was on the right track. But he said, you know what? This young man Wallace beat me to the punch. He's young, he's clever, I'm an old man and done. Let him publish, let him come forward with it. He'll do well. I had my chance. And Lyell says to Darwin, no way, buddy. You have been working on this thing for decades. You are not just going to roll over because this young snot-nosed kid that nobody's heard of before has come up with the same idea as you. Claim your life's work already. And Darwin reluctantly agrees, okay, I'll bring my ideas forward, but only on the condition that this young man Wallace gets equal billing. And thus it was that on July 1st of 1858, a joint paper by Darwin and Wallace is presented to the Linnean Society of London, a paper entitled On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties and on the Perpetuation of Varieties and Species by Natural Means of Selection. Ironically enough, neither Darwin nor Wallace is present for the reading of that paper. Wallace has not yet returned from his adventures. Darwin is confined to his home with his chronic illness. Lyell delivers the paper on their behalf. But cat's out of the bag now. So Darwin says, all right, time has come. He edits his manuscript, pulls together the last things in it, incorporates some new ideas he's been encountering and some new finds that have been made, and brings it forward. Thus it is that on November 22nd of 1859, Darwin publishes the work for which he is most famous, a book whose full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It did not have a gift for succinct titles. This book spells out Darwin's thesis in extraordinary detail. Darwin knew he had a lot of convincing to do, and so he makes this book a tour de force of evidence, chapter after chapter after chapter, patiently and carefully explaining his ideas with evidence from everything from embryology to paleontology to modern animal breeding to the fossil record to animal observation. Darwin lines up as many lines of evidence as he possibly can to support his ideas. Now, in The Origin, as we often call it, The Origin or The Origin of Species, Darwin never uses the word evolution. He doesn't call it that. In fact, the only time he even uses the word evolved is as the very last word in the very last edition of The Origin that he publishes before his death. Darwin uses other names for his ideas. The concept of evolution has been around for a while. Darwin is proposing a mechanism by which it happens. Two key ideas he brings forward. The first and most famous of those you probably know is the concept of natural selection. A lot of this comes by remodeling Thomas Malthus's economy ideas based on what Darwin has seen in the natural world itself. Darwin notes that there is variation in the world, that not all members of the species are the same. He cannot explain the origins of variation. He simply writes that variation, as he puts it, arises by chance, since he doesn't have a hereditary theory. He notes that the world poses many challenges for organisms, that there is a struggle for existence, and that the environment will never be able to support every living thing that is born. Therefore, Darwin says that favorable variations, variants that are better suited to the environment that you live, will be more likely to succeed. That is, organisms that are the most fit for the environments. Now, when Darwin uses the word fitness, he doesn't mean like physical fitness, like strong and healthy. He means best suited to the environment you find yourself in. And Darwin says that favorable variants that make you the best fit for your environments will be the most successful, and organisms with those variants will succeed the most. And by succeed, I should point out Darwin does not mean survive. He means reproduce. Survival of the fittest was not Darwin's term. It was originated by an English social theorist by the name of Edward Spencer, who, among other things, was arguing that Irish people should not be allowed to breed. Darwin was not a fan of this idea, although he does incorporate the phrase survival of the fittest and tries to sort of reclaim it in later editions of The Origin. But he wasn't a big fan of that term himself. Now, if you reproduce more, you pass on the features that help you to reproduce to your offspring, and therefore they have the same advantages as you. This is natural selection. Nature selecting the variants that are most useful. It's different than what Lamarck proposed, because Lamarck said, okay, there's a need in the environment, therefore you develop a feature to meet that need. Darwin is saying, nope, the environment is already full of variation, and the features that succeed, the variants that work, are the ones that are best suited to that environment. If nobody in the environment has a useful feature to meet a new challenge, your species goes extinct. So that's natural selection. The other idea Darwin puts forward is descent with modification. Please be careful of your spelling, D-E-S-C-E-N-T. Descent with modification. What today modern biologists often call speciation. In other words, the idea that over time, you're gradually going to accumulate more and more variations, that little by little, as the environment changes, Darwin points out the world is very old. He draws upon uniformitarianism here. He says that change is slow and gradual, and that in a very old world, organisms will meet a variety of different demands and challenges. This means that they will have to adapt in new ways over time, and that little by little, as my organism adapts to meet the novel demands of a changing world, it will look less and less like what I had before, until eventually I have something that is recognizably different than the previous organism, a new species of life. So those are Darwin's big innovative ideas: natural selection and descent with modification. Puts this book forward, puts it out in 1859. The book is quite popular, sells quite a lot. Darwin is famous by this time, and he's noted among the general public as a guy who can explain science in down-to-earth terms. Lots of people buy his book. And contrary to what you might expect and what Darwin himself expected, there is not a lot of controversy, at least not initially. Yeah, there's some conservative backlash. There are some folks who say, well, Mr. Darwin's ideas are contrary to Christian teaching and so forth. There are a few scientists who disagree with Darwin's ideas, but primarily because they like Lamarck's ideas better. And most scientists look at this work and are like, oh, well, this all sounds good. Yeah, this fits in with the things we've been thinking. Well done, Mr. Darwin, you've done it again. And in fact, it doesn't make a lot of stir. The Linnaean Society of London reports that no major discoveries were made that year in its annual review. But the Origin sells well, and Darwin's ideas, little by little, begin percolating into the biological sciences over the next decade. So Darwinian natural selection is taking off. And Darwin continues his work. He continues writing about fossils and about flowers and about all sorts of other things. But things change in the year 1871, when Darwin writes his second great work, the one he is not as well remembered for, but the one that ultimately throws his life into chaos. It is a book called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, often just called The Descent of Man for short. In this text, Darwin introduces two new ideas. One of them is the idea of sexual selection, the idea that sometimes natural selection favors features that help you to reproduce, even if those features are not good for survival. For example, he points out the feathered tail of the peacock, that the male peacocks with the biggest, brightest displays of feathers get the most mates and therefore have the most offspring, even though the bigger, brighter display of feathers slows you down and makes you more likely to get eaten by a fox. The other idea Darwin puts forward in The Descent of Man is right there in the title, in which he says, hey, you know that natural selection thing I was telling y'all about 10 years ago or so? We do that too. You as humans do that too. Humankind came from a simpler precursor. We as well underwent a process of gradual adaptation and evolutionary change. We are not the first of our kind, and we will not be the last. And we are descended from a simpler member of the animal kingdom. Darwin went with Linnaeus' classification that humans are primates, that the chimpanzee and the gorilla are our closest living relatives. And on that basis, Darwin made the prediction that the fossils of the earliest humans would eventually be found in Africa. Up till this point in time, the only human fossils that had been discovered had been found in Greece, Spain, and Germany, Neanderthal skulls. But Darwin says the cradle of mankind was Africa. This was where the controversy begins. That Darwin is saying that humanity originated from a simpler form, that we were not specially created by God to be exactly as we are, that we too went through a cycle of evolutionary change in which there was no guaranteed success, that we are not the acme of creation, we are the latest model. But I will tell you right now, a thing that most science historians will not tell you, because a lot of people miss this bit, that the initial opposition to Darwin was not on the basis of saying that humans had evolved. It was on the basis of saying we had come from Africa. That was what got people pissed. The idea that somehow Africans were the first humans, not white people. A lot of vicious editorials and reviews of Darwin's work talked about that proposition being an assault to the dignity of mankind. Racism, folks. The religious opposition came later. The racist opposition came first. Don't forget that. But this whole thing explodes quickly. Politicians denounce Darwin's ideas. Priests denounce him from the pulpit. Darwin is excommunicated from the Anglican Church. The popular press that has been treating him as their darling for years turns against him, publishes vicious cartoons of Darwin's head on the body of a monkey. Numerous scientists even turn against him. And Darwin's name is dragged through the mud for daring to propose that humans underwent an evolutionary process with an African genesis. Darwin, at this point in his life, is too sick to come to the defense of his own ideas. He hardly leaves his home anymore. So other people pick up that torch. Charles Lyell gives lectures explaining evolutionary concepts to people. Alfred Russel Wallace, whom as far as we can tell never showed any grudges about Darwin becoming more famous than him for the same idea, becomes one of Darwin's loudest defenders. Perhaps his most famous defender is the young scientist Thomas Henry Huxley, an important figure in early cell biology. Huxley becomes known as Darwin's bulldog because of his challenge to anyone, scientist, politician, or priest, to debate them in public about the merits of Darwin's evolutionary concepts. And Huxley becomes very well known for these quite vociferous debates that he gets into. Doesn't hurt that Huxley is pretty easy on the eyes. He's young, handsome, dark-haired, debonair, very well-spoken, very charismatic. He's a good spokesman and a good arguer, quite eloquent as well. The most famous of these debates, incidentally, happens between Huxley and a famous paleontologist named Richard Owen. Richard Owen, born in 1804, died in 1892, is the dinosaur guy. He conceives the term dinosauria for this group of reptiles. And ironically enough, Richard Owen, the dinosaur guy, is an opponent of Darwinism. He does not believe in evolution. Huxley and Owen have a very famous public debate about this. During this debate, Huxley, who is better spoken, handsomer, and frankly has the better argument than Owen, shuts down Owen's anti-Darwin arguments again and again. And finally, Owen becomes frustrated and decides to go for insults and says, "Well, tell me, Mr. Huxley, are you descended from the monkey on your father's or your mother's side?" And Owen says in reply, "I would rather be descended from an ape than from a cultivated man who uses his gifts of culture and eloquence in the service of prejudice and falsehood." That is your 19th century comeback singer. Now, Darwin dies peacefully in his home in April of 1882. I wish I could say this debate died with him. But you all live in the same world as I do. You all know how this works. You know that Darwin's ideas have continued to be fought over. They are picked up by other people. Herbert Spencer applies Darwin's ideas to social Darwinism, the idea that society is vicious and that those who can't cut it should be left to die, and that certain kinds of people are inherently inferior. Francis Galton runs with this and produces the idea of eugenics, selectively breeding humans to make a better human, not inherent in Darwin's ideas. Darwin's buried in Westminster Abbey, a great honor for a scientist. He's buried right near, if you go there today, buried right near Isaac Newton and William Herschel. He is survived by 7 children. 2 others died in infancy. 1 daughter died at the age of 7. 3 of his sons go on to become members of the Royal Society of London for their own research in botany and astronomy and engineering. Another one of his sons is the mentor to Sir Ronald Fisher. Ronald Fisher is a name who becomes quite important in 20th century biology. Ronald Fisher, born in 1892 and dies in 1966, is going to famously meld Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, the thing that his great-grandfather, Charles Darwin, never succeeded in doing. And Ronald Fisher is going to ultimately become the father of what today biologists call the modern synthesis. Mendelian genetics, Darwinian natural selection as the explanatory mechanism for variation and change. And yes, here in the modern world, we are still fighting the fight over Darwin's ideas for some reason. I should point out a fun little history of science fact for you all. Natural selection is the single best proven idea in any branch of science. Those of you who are scientists know that we don't talk about really proving anything, that everything is only as good as your evidence, and your evidence is always subject to revision if you find better evidence. But people have been trying damn hard to knock over Darwin's ideas for a good 150 years now, and every single study attempting to do so has only proven that he was right. 5 million peer-reviewed studies have asserted the validity of Darwin's ideas. That's a lot more than for gravity, I should point out. Theory doesn't mean speculation. Theory means well-established and supported by the facts. Don't forget that. But we're still fighting this fight. There are still young Earth creationists still talking about good old James Ussher's 4004 BC date. There are still people pushing to get intelligent design, which is creationism dressed up in scientific language, incorporated into public schools and teaching the controversy. We're still fighting this fight. But I want to remind all of you, as a science historian, let's look back to other great scientific revolutions. Let's remember that Isaac Newton's mathematically explicable ideas were not widely accepted for more than 50 years. Let's not forget that Copernicus's ideas were not widely accepted until Newton demonstrated mathematically that they worked. 150 years is frankly not a bad turnaround to begin accepting the validity of a major scientific revolution. And I am hopeful that maybe within our lifetimes we'll be able to put this debate to bed, and that the folks who are worried about this being an affront to religion and human spirituality and dignity will remember that 500 years ago, folks said that Galileo and Copernicus's ideas of heliocentrism were an affront to religion and to human dignity. And now pretty much everybody's on board with that, and nobody worries about how it's going to affect spirituality anymore. And religion ticks right on, and so does science. And I am hopeful in the fullness of time we'll say the same thing about evolution. But I have run a good bit longer than I wanted to go. I apologize for this being a very extended lesson, but there was important stuff to be said here. So I bid you all a good night, and I will talk to you soon. Our next lesson is going to deal with who else was doing science in the 19th century and what they were up to. Have a good night.